Let's make sure that our microphone actually works. And yeah, we've got everything going as far as I could tell to the correct place. So we'll go over on YouTube and yeah, okay, so here we are. One is watching us. It could be us. Who's
I
watching
think
us.
it's probably us.
It's probably us. Oh, we're getting some feedback.
Going as far as I can tell.
There we go. That should kill our feedback. So can you guys hear us? Anybody who is actually tuning in? We haven't done anything in so long that I don't expect people just to show up because we decided to come here today. But if you are here and you're watching and you hear us and you want to type something into the chat and say, yes, I actually hear you, that would be great to know.
Well, they would have to type the code word.
Hmm. That's true. And in order to type it, we'd have to have been able to tell it to them.
Well, maybe.
Have you been doing something without me knowing? Okay, I don't know. Anyway,
No.
so let's get started. Why did we decide to podcast today? Was it a sense of guilt for not podcasting so long? Was it a real particular thing that we had to say? Was it resigning ourselves to the new normal and figuring, okay, we'll still podcast? What is it?
New normal. Gee, no. This was the very last thing I had on my mind that, I'm not feeling really fired up to participate, let's say, in debates these days. But if there's one thing that is really, well, let's call it interesting about these times, is that when you use normal as a standard, the new normals is really these two completely different ideas about what is going on, right? About what is safe and what is effective.
Well, we can talk about that. But so I think I have felt the same, and it's interesting. I'm going to read you guys a passage that was brought to my attention for the first time by Stephen Hicks, a philosopher who I follow on Facebook. And he was mentioning this sort of feeling where you feel kind of worn down, unmotivated. Someone had put it, there was something on Twitter, excuse me, I have a cat hair that is stuck to me right now. I have to move it. This cat, oh my God, she sheds like crazy. Anyway, this person was talking about the fact that the millennials are having to cope with the fact that they have now they're enduring 3 events, all of which they've told has been like it's a lifetime unprecedented event or something, thing after thing after thing.
Mhm.
Now, we're not as young as millennials, but for us, it does seem like, yes, we've been dealing with thing after thing after thing. So, we've had the coronavirus, then there's this war, and then all this inflation and all of this looming authoritarianism from the World Economic Forum. Who knows exactly what they're going to do in the face of all this inflation? What is the exit?
All these opportunities, coming
for
their
them to
way.
clamp down, right? So it's getting overwhelming, right? And, again, Hicks was posting about this the other day, and then he directs us to this passage by Camus. I'm going to read it to you. It's from Return to Tapasa, which was written in 1952. And it says, at noon on the half sandy slopes covered with heliotropes like a foam left by the furious waves of the last few days as they withdrew, I watched the sea barely swelling at that hour with an exhausted motion. And I satisfied the 2 thirsts one cannot long neglect without drying up. I mean, loving and admiring. For there is merely bad luck in not being loved. There is misfortune in not loving. All of us today are dying of this misfortune. For violence and hatred dry up the heart itself. The long fight for justice exhausts the love that nevertheless gave birth to it. In the clamor in which we live, love is impossible and justice does not suffice. This is why Europe hates daylight and is only able to set injustice up against injustice. But in order to keep justice from shriveling up like a beautiful orange fruit containing nothing but a dry, bitter pulp, I just switched those two words, sorry. I discovered once more at Tapasa that one must keep intact in oneself a freshness, a cool wellspring of joy, love the day that escapes injustice, and return to combat having won that light. Here I recaptured the former beauty, a young sky, and I measured my luck, realizing at last that in the worst years of our madness, the memory of that sky had never left me. This is what in the end had kept me from despairing. I had always known that the ruins of Tapasa were younger than our new constructions or bomb damage. There the world began over again every day in an ever new light. O light, this is the cry of all the characters of ancient drama brought face to face with their fate. This last resort was ours too, and I knew it now. In the middle of winter, I at last discovered that there was in me an invincible summer. End quote. So, sometimes we are going to be looking to passages like this, to a perspective that is broad and historical, perspective that is a larger perspective in order to try to put in its place all the challenges of today and to continue on. My response to Hicks at the time, of course, was the phrase that I keep coming back to from different angles all the time, which is "don't let it go," which is the phrase that I chose as the title of my blog and of this podcast when I first started it so many years ago. And of course, it has evolved tremendously in my mind.
What it means to you.
Yeah, what it means to me since that time. But it's still there. And yes, do not let this go. The thing that is within you that makes you come at life in a certain way, having a set of attitudes. The purpose for keeping alive that set of attitudes in you may change with the times that you're living in, so for instance, well, I don't know if I want to give the spoiler yet, because I'm changing a little bit of the focus of "Don't Let It Go" in my mind a tad bit from the original essay of Rand, and I have got a twist on it that I want to embody in a book. And obviously, I think Rand is right that the constellation of attitudes that she describes there, these subconscious ways of looking at human beings and life on this earth and the relationship between man and the universe, that these attitudes will help stave off totalitarianism, but
they're not enough.
Well, they're not enough, maybe. Well, certainly they're not enough, right? But then the other thing is the purpose is not only that as well, right?
Okay.
Yeah. So the purpose is not only that. In any event, so now there's some things that I felt like I wanted to talk about today. Like I said, some days ago, I encountered this passage from Stephen Hicks and thought, okay, yes, don't let it go. Let's kind of get back at this. And it may not be, that everything is looking super optimistic at a certain point. I think this fall, there's going to be a switch over to the Republicans. What exactly that means for the future, we can't say that it means everything's going to be saved and wonderful. The Republicans may have undermined themselves with the spiking.
The Republicans, really?
Yeah, I know. Spiking the football over the Roe versus Wade, which I guess we're still waiting for. It's not that all that rosy necessarily. So, but nonetheless, we do have to keep going. And there's a few things that I did want to talk about. And, broadly, I want to talk about this issue of safe and effective. But first, I'll tell a little story because we just got back. I went back and forth to Dallas. In Dallas is my father. And so my birthday was on Tuesday. His birthday was Thursday. Went to visit him. And driving up and back on I-35, we saw numerous blades of windmills, each blade
Yeah.
being transported.
Yeah, no, so how long are they?
They're just
20
huge.
yards apiece, something like that?
Oh, I couldn't, I'm kind of bad at that. They're huge. Each
No,
single-
easily 20 yards apiece.
You think 20 yards? Okay.
In length, well, easily, maybe a bit longer even, but you know,
Yeah.
to get people to imagine if they haven't been so lucky as to be
As to see them.
stuck in traffic behind them.
Each one is on this huge flatbed truck. And you know, the flatbed truck, you can only imagine how much gasoline it is consuming. In addition to the flatbed truck, you know, with the big oversized load side, you know, sign on the back, there's an entourage of little
One, two, or
cars.
three.
Yeah. For each of these big flatbed trucks, there's a few cars around it, sort of a front and behind, you know, guiding it through, escorting it down the highway. And because it is oversized and this entourage and everything, traffic is disrupted. So not only are they guzzling a lot of gasoline in order to transport this monstrosity, all the people around them are forced to slow down or navigate around and do various things. So time is taken out of their day.
Sure.
Probably more gasoline is consumed by the people around them otherwise too. So all of this is going on. And that's just one piece of the production and the installation of these.
Mhm.
Some birds are being killed by windmills out there. Of course, some people, you know, they dispute that, how many of them, but whatever, it's one small piece of the puzzle. What we know is that even if you've got thousands of these windmills operating at the same time, you are not going to get a dependable, reliable source of energy from them. And so the only thing I could think in my mind was, if you took all the money that was being channeled into this endeavor of making these huge, ugly windmills someplace on a, you know, I don't know, some plot of land, I guess in the north of Texas, or they were saying West Texas is where they
Well,
put
yeah,
these things.
because
whatever.
where it's flat or you're gonna want a hill or a mountaintop, something like
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
you know, where do you catch wind? So. you
But
go that
imagine
way.
you take all this money, right? You take all this money and instead you invest it in nuclear.
Mhm.
How far ahead would Texas be in making sure that what happened during the freeze, where we were without power, and then as a
Sure.
result of being without power, we were without water, which was even worse for days.
Mhm.
We don't want this to happen again.
Mhm.
And here they are, sunk cost fallacy, I guess. They are putting more money into the same failed alternative energy, clean energy
Yeah.
sources that
Well-
they did before. And they could do nuclear, right? And you had told me the other day that France with
Sure.
nuclear power is powering not only themselves, but they're selling electricity
Mhm.
to others, right?
Sure. Yeah. And so, of course, it's one of those other instances of safe and effective, right? So some fears are more equal than others because you're not allowed to have second thoughts about undergoing a particular type of medical treatment or let's say preventive medical treatment, because you're being an arbitrary dunce, right? Or let's say, no, on the other hand, fears about nuclear power, you know, should be let go without any moderation. So yeah, it's another instance of safe and effective, I would say.
Well, doesn't nuclear power at this point have a much longer track record than the
No,
so-called
well,
safe and effective
yeah, but-
things we've been sold in the last
No,
couple
sure.
of years?
Well, no, with fossil fuels, quote unquote, it's safer than burning wood, you know, in your home. At the same time, you know for sure that you are going to emit certain contaminants, and it's again, speaking in terms of safe and effective, it's a matter of balancing the risk against the advantage. And for fossil fuels, it's better than for wood, and for natural gas or LNG, it's better than for coal, et cetera, et cetera.
But nuclear.
But yeah, and so interestingly, the French do it, and it's one of those particularities. It's not controversial in France because they've seen and they profit from it, and there haven't been any disasters yet in neighboring countries. Take Germany or Belgium. They want to eliminate it. So that's really bizarre. And of course, in the meantime, they do buy nuclear power from the French. So it gives you an idea of how good people are generally at being selective in what they see and don't see.
Compartmentalized.
Yeah, sure.
But yeah, I just thought I had to tell that little story of bumping up against what I see as irrationality, as putting investments, and it's probably because there's government behind this, right? I'm understanding that there's certain incentives that have been put in place for wind power long ago. And, whereas in business, if you saw that a strategy was failing, you would take your money out of that investment and you put it someplace else, right? And you would do it pretty quickly. In government, everything takes forever. And so, you're seeing people follow through on decisions made by bureaucrats long ago, probably before even the freeze was, took place. And it's just sad because, again, I'm just imagining all the resources they're putting into this and what could be achieved if they had diverted that towards bringing nuclear power plants to Texas. Because Texas, for me, right now, we're in the middle of a heat wave. And thankfully, we're sitting in a room where the air conditioning is working, fairly decently. If you have reliable power and electricity and air conditioning, then you can definitely survive the climate here. It gets cool enough at the night. You wake up in the morning, you can go out and get a nice walk. You don't stay in your house all day. You don't have to do that. But you have to kind of tailor your day a little bit, but you can definitely do it. It's quite doable. But if they're talking about these rolling blackouts that might come, obviously you want to have a good air conditioning repairman on call for those sorts of eventualities too. But that's what you need. That's what you need. And the people who are, preventing us from getting a grid that can handle the increase in people moving to Texas too, right? That's a thing as well. They've been very successful in attracting businesses here, including Elon Musk and everything that he's up to. And we should be able to support it. Again, supply should be able to catch up to meet demand relatively quickly, and in a free market it would. And in today's market, it's not. And it's because of government interference and government controls. So anyway, that's very frustrating. That's my little vent of the day. But I want to get to, I don't want to do a super long show. I want to, give you guys just a couple things to think about and move on. But I wanted to talk a little bit about why I'm calling this safe and effective. You hear that mantra all the time. Everything is safe and effective. The last thing that I actually saw labeled safe and effective was that, they've been making a recent push to bring masks back again. So on Twitter, of course, Twitter is like the ad for Biden policies or something. If it's trending on Twitter, it's basically an ad for Biden's policies, okay? And this headline said something like, masks are safe and effective in preventing COVID-19, experts say. And that's, that's what they always like to do. Experts say whatever the thing is we want you to believe today. And, you could say, okay, well, a mask, you put a mask on, how unsafe is it? But I'll even tell you that there are safety issues with respect to masks. One that we know about with respect to kids is developmental,
Sure.
know,
Well, there,
developmental milestones with respect to
there are
some kids
several.
have been hindered. These masks, where are they made? What chemicals are they made with? And you're putting this on your face and you're breathing whatever this
Yeah,
is, right? And you're breathing it for hours. And in case of, the N95 type masks, you're really cutting the air off. I mean, and the more kind of lighter masks or some of the cloth masks or whatever, maybe you've washed it yourself. And so it's relatively clean, but you're actually breathing whatever this is. You're impeding the flow of air to a certain extent for long periods of time. That's not great.
but you collect germs in the mask.
Sure,
So
sure.
yeah.
And again, I always like to.
That's why some people call it a mascubator. Well, you were waiting for that, right? So,
I don't know.
excuse
But
me.
no, but I mean, the other thing that I always keep going back to is the psychological aspect of wearing masks. How safe is it for human beings to interact, when they're in person only when they're wearing masks, so they can't have a real full human interaction? And otherwise, all they do is they talk to each other on Zoom or phone calls or whatever.
Yeah, and then the best of them, of course, even wear the mask while on Zoom. We could try that once.
That was another thing that we saw when we were driving. We saw a couple different people who they're all alone in a car and they're wearing a mask, and I don't know why. Now, I think some Uber drivers will still wear masks, and depending on what your particular situation is, and if you want to wear a mask when you're an Uber driver for a stranger, maybe you want to protect yourself.
Well,
I can understand that, right?
Sure, wanting to protect yourself, but and actually doing something that helps.
Yeah,
and not,
that would be another thing.
I mean, a lot of it is, so it's not even virtue signaling. It's more, you communicate something else. I think.
No, it's certainly a certain type of, to me, detachment from just human life. Live in Texas, we've been fairly spoiled. There haven't been a whole lot of requirements for masks here, and so we've been able to interact with our fellow human beings in a fairly normal way for quite some time. But anyway, that's just one thing, and that was the last time that I saw the safe and effective. But of course, I'm always hearing safe and effective in reference to that certain preventative sort of treatment that people like to dance around when they are on YouTube, so that they don't undergo certain types of restrictions of information flow that happen on YouTube all the time. So we will dance around it in the way that Brett Weinstein and other people who I think are worth listening to do these things. And I wanted to just bring up this one point that I thought was so good that he was discussing with Neil Oliver recently. By the way, the discussion between him and Neil Oliver is excellent. One of my hesitations of doing a podcast is that, maybe I need to get a better microphone or get a vocal coach, and I could work on, having the deeper, sexier podcast voice or something. But I feel
I don't know.
No matter what I did, I would never have a voice that was fun and interesting to listen to as Neil Oliver. I just don't think it's possible.
Sure. And of course I tried, by applying insistent heavy breathing, but then somebody complained about that. And so now I don't know where I'm at, really. But
we have no gimmicks. We have absolutely no gimmicks to get you to listen. No, but so this one point that really struck me, and Benjamin and I, if you haven't heard our story, we both did partake in this certain preventative measure that was recommended to us, and then sort of strongly recommended to us, and that we were going to be humiliated if we did not take this certain medical preventative measure a couple years, or a year and a half ago, a year and a couple months ago. Anyway, we decided to take it. Why? Because we were told that here in Texas, it was always voluntary and never forced. We did it. We did 2 rounds of it.
Mm.
And a few months later, we started to question the wisdom of having done it, right? And so the question is, and this preventative is always deemed to be safe and effective. That's what people always talk about. Doesn't matter, and not everybody says this, obviously, but there are still a number of people who just, I mean, to me, I'm not sure if they're thinking while they're saying this, but they just say safe and effective. And Weinstein brings up a particular example when he talks about whether you could add the label safe to something like that, right? And he says, suppose you walk into a room and there's just a gun sitting on a table, right?
Yeah.
There's a gun sitting on a table, and you put the gun up to your head and you pull the trigger,
It goes
and
click.
click, and then you're still alive, you put it down and you're done. And the question was that safe?
Mm-hmm.
Now, you didn't get hurt, but was it safe?
Yeah.
And most of us who know that gun safety does not consist of taking a gun of unknown status and assuming that it does not have bullets in it and, click to your head, that is not a safe thing, that that even if you haven't been hurt, then that doesn't mean that what you did was safe. And it's interesting because he has, in that sense, he has an objective connotation of what safe means, right? It's not just the fact that you did not get hurt, but it's, were you acting in a safe manner given what you knew at the time doing that thing? And I actually now, when I look back on, was it safe for us to take that medical preventative measure that we were sort of encouraged to do? I would say no. And that the reason that I felt at the time very unsettled about doing it and sat around during the 15 minutes afterwards saying, was I going to have this reaction to it? And I mean, I literally for the 15 minutes was very nervous. I don't know about you, I was. And so at least for me, based on my thoughts about, having this new technology at the time administered to me, not having any long-term track record for any of this, which we still don't have, can you say it's safe? And I would say no. I'm hoping that what happened is the same as the click of the gun, and that all of us are going to be fine. All of us who undertook this experimental medical advance, that we're all going to be good.
Sure, but he makes the intelligent distinction with his example and his elaboration that you have to separate the evaluation based on the available evidence, right, from any particular outcome that you may or may not have. And of course, again, and he didn't talk about that, it also depends on your particular situation for you to be able to weigh risks against benefits. But of course, if you don't weigh the risk at all, that's another way of saying it's not really about anything productive or instrumental. It's very much like choosing wind over nuclear. So
no, but I mean, the idea of injecting something into your system that's based on a new technology that hasn't been tried before and doesn't have a long-term track record in this particular application, you cannot say that it's safe. You just can't say that.
It doesn't mean anything.
So what we've done is not safe. They're actually lying to us. Now, it may turn out that none of us is going to end up being harmed, but there have been
obviously that doesn't apply to everybody. So,
Yeah, some people
Yeah,
have definitely been harmed.
yeah.
But yeah, so this idea of when people are telling you that something is safe and effective, to me now it's a trigger word. If somebody tries to tell me that something is safe and effective,
mhm,
I'm going to now pay extra attention to it and figure out whether it is actually safe or effective. Of course, we didn't even talk about effective. If you want to look at effective, just go to Bad Catitude on Substack or Alex Berenson. He does some work on these things. Matthew Crawford, although I find him harder to sift through sometimes. Rob Wolf has got some good stuff on this as well. Hiram over in the chat, thank you. Hiram asks, don't you think that appointment only motor vehicle service is way worse than mask mandates? This is something that's been going on in Texas. So I was speaking to somebody a few days ago who ended up, right, because of this appointment only service and because the appointments were made available really far out in the timeline, this person actually ended up having to take a driving test because he had to wait so long, to get his appointment here in Texas, that the license from his out of state had expired. And so he had to go through that whole thing. So in a way, they took certain measures here that were not really rational either. Yes, that might be, you could say it's worse than, but I would say that anybody who says it's worse than mask mandates is probably somebody who had to suffer through that themselves.
Probably.
Again, for me, the issue of the mask mandates and the issue of the lockdowns is not only the killing of businesses, that was a huge thing with the lockdowns, but it was also the making it so that human interaction was reduced to behind a screen, which has all sorts of psychological side effects and consequences, which are not good as far as everything that we can tell. And, I work for policy for Parler, a social media platform. And whereas Parler, we don't have the engagement enhancing algorithms and things that I think increase anger and division on the other platforms. Nonetheless, the mere fact that people are just interacting through a computer will make them feel a bit isolated from the other person, such that they feel more comfortable saying things to them that they wouldn't say in person. So even if you don't have the algorithm that's making that issue worse, that issue even is still there. And so I feel like having a true human interaction is a face-to-face thing, and it's definitely hindered with people wearing masks all the time. I couldn't even imagine, I was just laughing when, a couple weeks ago, they were talking about the Biden administration wanted to bring back the masks again. I've heard a couple of trial balloons about they want to have masks because of monkeypox, which is ridiculous as far as I can tell from the transmissibility, particularly asymptomatic transmissibility of that. You just,
So
there's no reason. There's no good reason for the masks.
So maybe that's also the way in which we should understand the term safe and effective. It's like a mantra, right? So it represents a type of world that stimulates or pushes this idea of being exempt from any risk or danger. And of course, what it does is really the opposite. You can give so many examples, but it also applies for covering your face because we take so many cues, right, from a face. And that's also why it's developmentally so grave to inflict this on children, because they're still learning to read facial expressions. How does somebody feel? And so if you think about it, it's amazing how we learn to read all these clues, even unconsciously at a certain point, right? So you take away all of this, and how so the assumption would be you're making people safe, but what you're actually doing is you rendering them unable to gauge, to assess people, to judge people, and this, of course, is a superficial thing, but there are many cases in which it is very helpful for you to know whether somebody is at ease or happy or in distress, etc. So it's
And it just also alienating, right? So one of my concerns,
well,
one of the things that recently, of course, discouraged me from wanting to even talk on a podcast was the Uvalde mass shooting incident, which is horrible. And my concern is, this kid was right at that age of 18 where they were locked down the last couple of years of school. So imagine, they were alienated further. Teenagers are already in this stage where they're feeling awkward and alienated. How many kids were damaged by these policies in ways that push them in directions that they might not otherwise? And then, to have them, of course, blame the accessibility of guns or other sorts of course, there were a lot of things that went on in Uvalde, but my largest concern is that there are people who have been damaged, affected by just these policies of lockdowns and mask mandates, alienated from their fellow human being, unable to interact and have the people around them, sort of get them the help that they need and things like that. I'm concerned about what the next few years, what even the next generation, what effects we're going to see in the future. And I'm concerned that, again, authoritarians ready to clamp down and impose their favored policies to, grab power or wealth or whatever it is that they think they're doing, that they're going to just use this as an excuse or an opportunity, which of course will make things much worse.
Yeah, well, I think, and of course, the context for me is having recently read Jonathan Haidt's book, The Coddling of the American Mind, is that over a longer period of time, this whole mask thing is really, I won't say a logical consequence, but possible further development of a process that they describe very well in that book. And so the way they see it is intertwined with Generation Z's being subjected to the mostly to social media, but there's a number of other factors, and they refer to helicopter parenting and this idea that you can and should create an environment free of risk, right? And then, of course, as you go along, it takes less and less for something to qualify as a risk. So it's this, it's an escalating cycle, really, of an expectation of the absence of of ever smaller input that is perceived as risk, because as you sterilize your environment more and more, it takes less to upset people. And of course,
so that's not everybody though, right? So this is interesting because one of the things that I also took away from the conversation, and I'm still not done listening, actually, by the way, between Neil Oliver and Brett Weinstein, that Oliver said that for the first time, and I think he said he was 53 at the time or whatever, for the first time in his 53 years, he had sort of the lizard brain fight or flight response. And it was to the fact that with respect to these, medical preventatives, that instead of being given an argument you know, a dispassionate,
Mhm.
calm, reasoned argument as to why these are safe and effective, or why you
Mhm.
should take them, why, you know, the risk benefit analysis is in favor of these. Instead, what we were given was ridicule and, of course, a huge stick. You know, it was, if you don't take this, there's going to be these consequences, and if you
Mhm.
still don't take it, there's going to be bigger
Yeah.
consequences. I mean, you know,
Yeah.
one of the reasons
Yeah.
that you and I were thinking we would do it is because it would be a requirement for travel. Little do we know that in order to travel to some places, you have to take a subscription and just
Yeah.
keep getting
Yeah. Yeah.
injected with
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
stuff forever. So
Yeah.
it got us
Yeah.
nowhere,
Mhm.
right? So, you know, he immediately had this response. And so I attribute it to the fact that he is very grounded again in this long-term historical perspective,
Mhm.
where he, you know, as an archaeologist, was well aware of the amount of risk that human life entailed for us throughout most of humanity, right? So for him, he would retain a lot of the perspective that a lot of us would forget in just, you know, living our comfortable lives where there was very little
Yeah.
risk, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. So you're basically saying that you know he had this rational argument, but for me, I'm not saying I have an answer, but I have a suspicion that you know that there's a different trait, a different yeah characteristic that allowed people not to be as susceptible to these pressures, because it
Okay.
is the pressures that in the end that that do make people go along, right?
Right.
And that's, it's not exceptional in the sense that our world has become so complicated that there's nobody who can weigh the evidence, you know, on a series of questions such as which car is technically superior, what house or what type of construction is superior over another. And you know, you can go on and on and on about all these daily issues. And obviously, nobody is capable of keeping track of the state of the art in each and any field. So you rely on, what do you rely on?
Well, you rely on experts, but
Mhm.
you don't. And, you know, again, this goes back to something that I've explained before that I learned from Leonard Peikoff,
Mhm.
you know, in his teaching of his
Mhm.
introductory logic course. I
Yeah.
don't know if he came up with this material himself. He probably put it together from a compilation of intro
Mhm.
logic materials that he had studied. But he talked about the fact that in order to use experts and
Mhm.
rely upon experts in a way that is epistemologically proper, you know, proper according to a good theory of knowledge and how you
Mhm.
acquire it, that you have to go through 3 steps. You don't want to commit the fallacy of appeal to authority. You don't
Mhm.
want to just blindly accept something because some expert said so,
Mhm.
right? So what do? You look at the expert's credentials, background, and you say, okay, is this somebody who actually knows enough to even, you know, be worth listening to
Mhm.
on this, right?
Mhm.
So, you know, if I want to know something about a medical condition that I have, preferably I'm going to look at people who either are certified and, you know, trained experts in that field, or you know that they've done a tremendous amount of study for a very long time and that they can cite chapter and verse, et cetera. And you know, they know enough to be worth listening to. Then you get an explanation from them
Mhm.
as to what it is you should do in your particular situation and why, right? And if they really know what they're talking about, they should be able to give you an explanation that you
can grasp.
can grasp.
Sure.
But then
Mhm.
even then, you can't just go, okay, I'll just accept it. What you do is you say, okay, I'm going to think, maybe I have to act in a certain situation. I have to decide whether or not to get this particular, preventative medical treatment and, take
But
a trip that I want to take or whatever. And then what you do is you make your decision according to your values and how
Mhm.
certain you feel about it. But even then, even if you make the decision, so we made the
Mhm.
decision to, take this
Mhm.
thing. It's not like we said, oh yeah, we're certain that this is the right path. I mean, especially for me, like I said, I was quite nervous about it.
Mhm.
And you say, okay, I think, I've weighed everything and given everything that I know right now. I think this is the right path. Experts that I respect have said this thing about it. And I think that, it's the best decision that I can make right now.
Mhm.
And it is not an attitude of certainty. You yourself don't have the time to become an expert on everything in the world.
Mhm.
And so the idea that you can say with confidence that you are certain that, a particular medical
yeah.
preventative is safe and effective
that's
when you
nonsense.
yourself are
Yeah,
not that
yeah,
expert,
yeah.
it's just ridiculous.
Yeah.
So like I say, so many of the people who say, oh, it's safe and effective, they have no business saying it. Now, Weinstein makes a point that nobody has the business saying it because we don't have the long track record right now.
Mhm.
Anyway,
Mhm.
you just can't even say safe.
Yeah.
But even to say effective is something that only an expert
Mhm.
can really be
Mhm.
certain about. And yet there are certain people within circles that we know about, one in particular that I am thinking of, who was quoted as saying that if you were to raise doubts about the safety
Yeah.
and effectiveness of this particular
Mhm.
medical treatment, that you were saying something arbitrary,
Yeah.
which is completely wrong.
Well, which was an arbitrary assertion in itself.
Perhaps. I mean, that would be interesting,
Well,
right?
yeah.
But
Not to complicate things, but well.
It's not the kind of, oh yeah, slam dunk. I think that, going around and treating people who are taking their own best interests seriously and weighing evidence and making the best decisions
Yeah,
available
well,
to them, and
so
respecting everybody else's right to
basically-
make the best decisions
Mhm.
available to them,
No,
that those people should also be treated with respect. And
Mhm.
Yeah, so enough said on that.
Yeah.
But what you were saying is this attitude, this issue of people sort of relying on experts and things like this, that there's certain types of attitudes that are the problem. And this actually kind of transitions into, and not as gracefully as I could have about 3 minutes ago, I'm going to transition into this last thing that I wanted to say, which was I happened to finally go back on Twitter after this little trip that we did. I don't go on Twitter that much. I'm waiting to see if Elon Musk actually acquires it. And I don't know if he's going to acquire it, because otherwise I'm pretty much shut down on Twitter. I have over 10,000 followers and maybe like 5 of them see my posts. So Musk was tweeting earlier today in reply to a tweet from a science account about the scientist Lister, who hypothesized, and then it was shown later to be true, that yes, if you washed your hands and actually sterilized your hands before doing surgery, then you were less likely to contaminate the patient, that they would have a better survival rate out of surgery. They certainly would have less infection. And Musk wrote, he says, Lister was ridiculed by the establishment, but he was right. We should question accepted wisdom and bow to the weight of evidence.
Mm-hmm.
And he seems to, again, I really like Musk, and there's a lot of good instincts that he has. With respect to his idea about content moderation. I've spoken in other places about the fact that his quantitative standard for whether or not you're doing his quantitative standard for whether or not you're doing content moderation correctly, I think is wrong. It's not a matter of how many people from each side you make mad. It's whether you're doing it according to a principle. and objectively. But then the second thing that I find in a lot of his statements about content moderation is too much deference to what happens to be the law in a particular place. There are a lot of places in the world that do not respect free speech in their law.
Mhm,
And
mhm.
there are ways to objectively deal with those situations that his deference might close himself off to. That's kind of my two critiques of what I've heard from him
Mhm.
so far, right?
Mhm.
In general, there's so much that I like about Musk, but here he is, right? In this tweet, he is, using the word bow. And, with the formulation of it, you're going to say I'm being nitpicky and whatever. But to me, the whole problem of the last few years was the demand that all of us bow to the whims of people, whether they're politicians or experts or
Yeah.
even media personalities, otherwise, these people who are offering us little to no evidence or argument or explanation, and we're supposed to bow to that. And what, Musk is trying to be helpful. He's trying to say, don't bow to the accepted wisdom. Instead, you bow to the weight of evidence.
Yeah.
And to me, I ask, should you be saying bow at all? You could put together a situation in which there is overwhelming evidence. How do you characterize it? Beyond a reasonable doubt, maybe. And it's something that it's beyond a reasonable doubt about a really important life-saving issue. And then, and there's been a long struggle to find this evidence, and this person presents it to you, and you're really impressed, and then maybe you bow. But bow doesn't seem to be the right word, right? It just or the right attitude, and the bowing seems to be the issue. You shouldn't be asked to bow. And to me, the kind of quick formulation I put together on Twitter was, how about instead we weigh the evidence, we make the best decision that we can, and we keep in mind that no one is omniscient or omnipotent.
Yeah.
And that seems a healthier way. And again, it's in line with that advice that I internalized from Leonard Peikoff, listening to his course, teaching intralogic for years, etc.
Sure. And maybe I would even expand it in Popper's direction, in the sense of, not bowing, but what you really can, let's not get into litmus tests, but what science requires is, endless questioning. And so that is what we should keep doing. And anybody suggesting that, we should, prostrate ourselves or bow or remain quietly intimidated with respect to any particular current answer is not going to do us any good.
Right. I mean, so Musk, when he's thinking of this particular example, which was, it's a really tremendous example. Again, just by washing your hands, maybe with a particular type of disinfecting substance, you have prevented infection through surgeries, which was a huge problem. Maybe you bow in that situation, right?
Okay. And now I'm going to up your ante, because that was subsequently applied to the home situation, where child rearing was accompanied by massive sterilization of the environment, and as we know now, so applying that fought over principle in one situation, applying it to a different context, resulted in a huge increase in allergies and lack of children's resilience and systems. And that exactly is what is being denied to children today. No, they're not allowed to develop their immunological resilience, no psychological resilience, because they have to be shielded from any perceived threat. no physical
Oh, yeah, so
resilience.
safe spaces in
Yes,
terms of content
yes,
too. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
exactly.
That's a whole nother topic, but yeah.
Well, I
need
think
to read the
wasn't this
coddling, right? And then we have the discussion.
about safe and effective?
Well, sure, definitely. Maybe the word looked for is cognitive dissonance. So cognitive dissonance in what context, Hiram? And then we can say a little bit more. The word looked for in which of the 5 things that he and I have said in the last 2 minutes or so, right? No, so the definitely the bringing it into a different context makes all the difference. And the thought that occurred to me when you were talking about that was the issue of injecting this, these spike proteins directly into an immune system too, right? There's a whole lot of things that, whereas they make sense in one context medically, they don't necessarily make sense in another context.
Well,
and so whereas you could see the rationale for, certain ways that they put together this preventative medical treatment, in other ways, now that we look at it from hindsight, you could say maybe it wasn't such a great idea after all, and Weinstein is actually full of those. I'll defer.
Well,
to that.
and maybe as to Neil Oliver, what he is familiar with thoroughly is the idea of hubris, right? And of people playing or imagining to be God, and that all this fidgeting with with this idea that of course they had been working on for something like 2 decades. This is the moment for a rollout, right? And you can see where where the idea of the mad scientist sort of came from. And of course it's not a new thing either. When was Dr. Frankenstein written, right? I mean,
right, no, of course. No, I mean, what we'll all do is hope. Denial of not falling for the so-called experts. I'm not denying that I fell for the experts. The denial of not falling, that the double negatives are getting to me here. But no, I certainly was taken in by the experts in the beginning. And then it was over time when I started seeing more and more evidence that I decided that maybe what we did was not such a good idea. And that I am hoping that while it was not safe, again, let's take safe literally, were you behaving in a safe manner? No, I don't think we were in hindsight. At the time I thought I was, but now I see no.
No, but it's a good question.
Yeah, no. So what do you see the question as, and how?
No, well, I was thinking about this myself, and this is also something that Oliver and Weinstein discuss, and it's something that I've been, struggling to answer. Where where did I develop doubts, or where do other people reach a more grounded situation? And I think that's the big challenge of identifying the type of argument that, and presumably that's different for a lot of people, what makes them open to a different perspective on these things. Because of course, if this sterilization of the environment continues, presumably it's going to be harder and harder to present people with free speech, with any challenge to viewpoints, et cetera, et cetera. So it is a relevant question, and I can answer what gave me the impetus to start thinking about things differently, but that's perhaps not what is interesting for this person. But I think stimulating as many people as possible to wonder for themselves is the real challenge.
Yeah. Hiram is saying perhaps over time, the cause and effect deductive reasoning just didn't add up to what the CDC initially insisted on over time. And we've seen a number of times where
Sure.
there were officials, either FDA or otherwise, who were saying that if you did undergo this particular
Procedure.
preventative treatment, that you would not be a vehicle for a virus
sure.
to spread.
Yeah, sure.
Right.
Sure.
That
Sure.
it was 100% effective
Mhm.
in preventing the spread of this. And of course, that did not
Mhm.
turn out. And then, of course, the promise was that if you underwent this procedure, that you would at least have a milder case of the
Mhm.
virus. And I think that's hard to evaluate because a lot of people would have a
Mm,
mild
well,
case
anyway,
of the virus
yeah,
anyway.
anyway, yeah,
And
yeah,
in my case,
Yeah.
I don't know if I've had it. I think I had it actually in 2019.
Mhm.
I have not had it since, which is interesting. And I've
Mhm.
a couple times thought I'd had it and been
you've
tested
you've
and
been exposed, and
I've been exposed and everything, and
yeah,
I'm always
yeah.
negative. So it's a weird thing. And so it's not anything that people could really even evaluate the claim, the retreat claim of the CDC, which was that you would have a milder instance
sure,
of
sure.
the virus. There's a lot of people who would have a milder case
Mhm.
anyway.
Yeah.
So who knows? But yeah, so
No, yeah, well, just to finish that thought, what broke the spell for me was trying to discuss, off-label options with people out there on the internet, and really being answered with this fervor and this true believer spirit that
Yeah,
really made me uncomfortable. And well, more than that, I started thinking, wait a minute, what is going on? Why are people who are not medical doctors, who are not personally involved, why are they responding with this type of visceral
maybe fear,
religious
well, okay,
fervor?
so I think, the explanation goes back to Peterson. And again, I'm wading through Peterson again. Jordan Peterson talks about the fact that if you question certain of people's beliefs and assumptions, they feel very threatened. It's basically you're questioning their whole worldview about the way that society works and their ability to predict how their fellow man is going to. So with, in some cases, perhaps if we are questioning science, somehow we are anti-science, if we question this particular scientific development. But of course you have to be in favor of science because you're in favor of reason. Aren't you in favor of reason?
Yeah.
And yes, I am. But this particular instance, I don't think has a long enough track record for me to feel completely comfortable. I don't see why it's so controversial. But in any event, I think people end up identifying so much with a particular worldview that if
it's a
the
set
people
of
around them
a
don't
set of
accept
opinions.
the same opinion the way they expect, it somehow feels threatening to them. That somebody who says that they agree with you on certain basic philosophical fundamentals about science being good and etc. doesn't accept your application of that to a particular field. It's as if they're questioning the whole foundation. And of course that foundation has to stay in its place. Otherwise you don't, in a sense, feel like you belong where you think you belong in society, etc. And this is the sort of thing that Peterson unpacks.
Sure.
And,
the groupthink, or the belonging, the tribal thing.
Yeah, I mean, there's two aspects of it, right?
Which is ironical then, because those who claim to be on the side of racial and reason, then start manifesting this tribal behavior, warning you, you should worry about your reputation, this kind of
Right,
thing.
I had that.
Yeah.
And what was
So-
the other one that I was told more recently? It was something that there was some defect in my actual thinking. And then I turned it around and said
Oh,
that if you
yeah, okay,
were,
yeah.
if you weren't open to the signs that there's creeping fascism in our society
Mhm.
today, and that some of the things that are being offered in the name of science are actually not a product of science, but in part a large, there's a large contribution to these that
Yeah.
are there because of
Mhm,
fascist tendencies
Sure.
in the
sure.
government.
Um,
If you're not open to that idea, at
Uh-huh.
least then
Uh-huh.
there is
But-
something wrong in your thinking, right?
Sure.
So,
But-
it has been an interesting ride, and,
Still
again,
is.
everybody, what can you do? There should be no demand of bowing. There should be no demand that
Yeah.
you agree with me, and any doubt you have that is contrary to my opinion is arbitrary.
Yeah.
There's something wrong with your thinking.
Yeah.
All
Please
these sorts of
prove me
pronouncements
wrong.
are
Yeah,
so
yeah, yeah,
authoritarian,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
No bowing, forget
Mhm.
this bowing. I'm not going to bow to somebody's pronouncement that something is safe and effective. I'm going to think for myself. I'm not going to tell you how to think.
Mhm.
We all have to get through this. So Jeremy says that I called BS on this whole crisis from the beginning. I did not, Jeremy, unfortunately. When the virus was first around and they were talking about lockdowns, I was saying, hey, as a human being worried about what this means, I would be willing to lay low for a couple weeks
Mhm.
to allow the hospitals and everybody to get up to speed and get ready to treat all of these patients. But I
Mhm.
really meant 2 weeks. So I gave it that.
Mm.
I did not call BS from the very beginning, but pretty
No.
quickly, I called BS enough to move from California to Texas. Okay, so I did it pretty quickly. What about you?
No, I wasn't that fast, but I was also processing a lot of information. And personally, I was also trying to be a sort of a positive factor, and not to get lost in the fear mongering one way or the other.
Mhm.
But I mean, obviously this is only one a little part of a larger battle, and I think that's the real challenge we've been handed, and in that sense, it's sort of all for the better that it has brought to the surface a number of plans, and how deep we want to dig into the question of actual plans, of course, and we can talk about the war games by which they practiced all the measures and all the
We could talk about some of that
demagoguery
as well,
and
so.
all that. But I think it might turn out to have been a blessing in disguise, because more people are aware of certain hazards now than they were before. Is that a terrible thing to say?
That was another thing that Oliver and Weinstein were weighing. If this crisis hadn't happened, then certain like-minded people who had this non-authoritarian attitude, this anti-authoritarian
Sure.
attitude, would
Mhm.
not have connected with each other.
Because
So,
they often do not share that much.
But,
in
again,
other fields,
a
right?
lot of people have died We still don't know the long-term outcome of these experimental treatments that we have
Sure.
many billions have undergone.
Mhm.
How many have undergone? Hundreds of millions at least.
Well, I think 2 billion now.
2 billion now, yeah.
Yeah.
So we get to hope that it is like, you know, Weinstein's metaphor of, you know, the gun that you, right? For some people it hasn't been, but we're hoping that for the majority of people it is that
Mhm.
way,
Mhm.
and that it's not a disaster. It's still not safe, but maybe not harmful for most, we're
Mhm.
hoping.
Mhm.
Anyway, that's what I've got today. I don't want to keep you guys any longer. I thank you for tuning in for this impromptu. We have, I want to try to do this regularly on Saturdays if we can do it from now on. What do you think? Can you swing it?
We can try.
We can try? Okay. So Saturday afternoons, I've not settled on an exact time yet. Go to don'tletitgo.com within a day or two, and I'll settle on a time and put it out there and announce it, and then we'll get going again. The excerpt from the Camus, I will put that here in the chat so you can check it out. And thanks to Stephen Hicks for posting it, because it really did kind of inspire me to come back. Oh, you got a Facebook click ID in there too. Sorry, guys. You're going to be tracked when you click on that link. You can just go to stephenhicks.org and try to avoid the Facebook click ID if you want. Okay. Thanks everybody for watching.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, we'll talk next time. Let me find our Zoom and end this thing.